Hello again. Nice to see you, especially. Um, and let's start off today with uh, generating motivation. So, um, just for the um, purpose of gathering our mind and doing our best to make use of the session, to consider where we are in terms of our um, commitment to a spiritual growth. Considering how best we can help or benefit all beings, or certainly those around us, and committing ourselves or recommitting ourselves again to the idea of doing the best we can to become better at helping through learning to become more aware of our minds, and observing, and then doing what we can to bring about positive mind and positive mind both within ourselves and within others. So for this purpose, we want to see what we can do to make use of this session to work towards that we might even become Buddhas to benefit all beings spontaneously. Okay, thank you. So where we were last week, where we introduced, we were Lama Tsongkhapa was taking us through the truth of suffering, and we've already looked at the 8 types of suffering, which was given by the the um, the method tradition of Sasanga, and then we looked at the 6 types of suffering as discussed by or given by Nagarjuna in the wisdom traditions, wisdom lineages. And then what we're now looking at is, in brief, also the general discussion of suffering, the truth of suffering, from Sutra as well, which was under the chapters Further Suffering. And primarily this was looking at the 3 types of suffering, which we covered a little bit last week, which was we covered the suffering of pain, or the cause suffering, where Je Rinpoche describes it as the same sort of pain, or increased pain, of having a boil or a blister or a burn and sticking it into salt water or into hot oil or something, which is even more painful. And then he also talked about the suffering of change, which is where you put it under cold water and it feels nice, but as soon as you remove it, or even after a while, even though there's some relief, the suffering returns, the pain returns. And where we left off is what the Lam Rim Translation Committee have called the suffering of conditionality. And there are different names for this. Is also known as the all-pervading suffering, or the pervasive suffering. And primarily what this represents is that while we remain in samsara, everything that we experience, even though it might apparently be joyful, is actually in the nature of suffering. Is probably the most complex or hardest to recognize immediately, and likewise is the easiest to feel a lack of recognition for. So in many ways, though, it's the suffering of conditionality, or the all-pervasive suffering, which provides us with the real impetus to become sincere in our practice. Because when we can recognize it, we can even slightly recognize it, then we are very, very swiftly become disenchanted by normal worldly life, and the sorts of attractions and the apparent pleasures of conditioned reality lose their allure in that sense. So in that sense, really, the purpose is when we can recognize this specific or pervasive suffering, then this is where we really notice the change, the transvaluation from being attracted to conditioned reality towards the idea of saying, no, this is actually, I need to now tread the path to enlightenment. So it's not surprising that Buddha, this was the very first teaching that Buddha gave, the very first part of the first teaching that Buddha gave about the truth of suffering, because it is that entry point where we can recognize the suffering nature of our environment, of our normal life, from moment to moment, that provides us with the impetus and the will to be disenchanted by it, move on into towards liberation. So the so this particular aspect is also this level of suffering, this pervasive suffering, is the best for us to recognize as the basis of compassion, because then, regardless of where any being is who is currently locked in the cycle of samsara, we're able to feel compassion for them. But we're only able to recognize and feel that compassion for them once we've been able to identify all pervasive suffering. So not only is it the basis of our renunciation, our willingness, or our disenchantment with some sort of normal conditioned life, but also all pervasive suffering is the basis of our bodhicitta, or of our loving kindness and our compassion, which drives us to take on responsibility towards benefiting all beings. And likewise, it is this which primarily that leads to our spiritual path, rather than, for instance, just going out and helping people who are visibly suffering, such as you find many people who are Buddhists, who are doctors, and who are doing great work being doctors or helping others from cause suffering because of the compassion that arises out of them. And there's nothing wrong with this. It's a wonderful thing to be able to do. But if one is able to recognize all pervasive suffering, then there's a tendency really to start thinking about the bigger picture rather than just the immediate pain that we can visibly see. So this is where we actually begin to extend our ability and our drive to eliminate not just cause suffering, but also the most subtle and the most iniquitous or most dangerous as well. I'm not sure about iniquitous. Anyway, so what does Lama Tsongkhapa say about this? Lama Tsongkhapa says that the suffering of conditionality is like it's neither being our boil is our inflamed boil or our burn is neither in contact with soothing or irritating substances, but because it's a boil, it doesn't matter. We still have this continual pain. And this is because of, or in light of the fact that our minds are dysfunctional. So what he's saying in terms of the mind being dysfunctional is that we are still subjected to or subject to mistaken ideas, which he's going to go and talk to us about or describe to us in terms of the way in which we perceive things or understand things, lead us down into the same sorts of traps that are the causes of suffering. So therefore, even though we may feel we might not recognize suffering in the moment, we might recognize suffering as being joyful. The problem is because our minds attach onto these situations in a deluded sense, or in an afflicted sense. We're afflicted, our mind's broken in this way, or in this dysfunctional way, then essentially we keep on making the same sorts of mistakes that bind us back into a samsaric mindset and into an unenlightened mind. So he gives an example. These are the examples that I said it was about to say this. For instance, attachment increases when a pleasant feeling arises. So we might be experiencing something really pleasant and say, well, Ben, you talked to me about saying, everything is miserably suffering. And then this experience I'm having right now is really wonderful. I'm, meeting a member of family, or I'm having a lovely ice cream, or a wonderful kiss, or whatever it happens to be, and there seems to be a huge amount of pleasure present. The problem is that actually this is tied to, because of the way in which our mind works, is tied to attachment, of course, attachment. So in the sense, the idea of wanting to have it again, to hold on to it, or to feel a sense of wanting to own it. And therefore this becomes a grasping mind, and it creates also and is based on the idea of self-grasping. It's I want this, this is mine, this is what I want to hold on to, this is my family, this is my ice cream, I want more ice cream. These sorts of minds, even though they're very subtle, are what cause suffering to us, because sometimes they're not going to happen, or sometimes we're not going to be able to get that, because the basic truth of the issue is that our sense of identity or self, the sense of self or identity that we give, or the objective reality that we give these things, is a mistake, due to their nature, which is impermanent, transitory, um, uh, uh, not able to be externally objective objects. They really belong very much to our current mindset. So therefore, what we see is that, and likewise, hostility arises when we feel pain. So this is when we feel pain. We don't, rather than just recognizing that pain is a normal response to discomfort, we attribute blame. We attribute blame. We don't necessarily recognize our own mood in the moment. We don't recognize our responsibility to or our ability to respond to the circumstance. Instead, what we do is we externalize, just like we do with the attachment. We externalize our responses, put the object outside of us, outside of our immediate experience, and turn what is primarily a mental experience into one which we perceive as being a physical, objectified experience, which is, of course, disempowering in our ability to take any control over it. So this is one of the aspects of pleasant, unpleasant. And again, he says, Jeremy, he says, we misapprehend our body. We sort of, even when we might not feel any specific pleasant or painful things, we have this idea that we see ourselves as being permanent, as see ourselves as not being able to, not going to die. We recognize, we find it very hard to recognize the impermanence of things around us. So we love them, we cherish them, and we look after them without thinking about the fact, this is going to pass. And because it's going to pass, and because we're attached to it, because we love it so much, we're going to feel suffering when it ceases, or when we cease, in that sense. So essentially, the fact that we have this tendency to grasp at, or to see impermanent objects as permanent, we see objects that are inherently neither, if you like, at the best, neither have any qualities that allow them to be objects of pleasure or pain. We objectify that, turn them into objects that cause us pleasure and pain. We misappropriate them and add on some sort of tag or quality that allows for us to be angry at them, or to cherish, or want to hold on to them, to grasp onto them, and ourselves in the same way. We can be angry with ourselves, or we can be grasp onto ourselves on terms of our pride and our willingness, and our narcissism, if you like, our willingness to value ourselves more than is actually of any value. So when we see this, then we begin to find that even regardless of whatever activities, whatever experiences we have, our contaminated mind turn that into a suffering experience, right? This is the point about it, which is that the suffering we might not be apparent to us in terms of our direct experience, but our response to that experience creates, it makes it a suffering experience, creates suffering. And therefore, anything that we engage in while we have a negative mind or a distorted mind, dysfunctional mind, whenever we respond or interact with that thing, it's going to be a cause of suffering for us because of our dysfunctional mind. And he says, Jeremy Shea says here again that it's attachment, this clinging on, which generally gives rise to suffering, such as future rebirth in the desire realm, which is why the attachment realm. Hostility brings suffering both in this life and also in future lives, and often leads to the lower realms, the miserable realms. Um, and ignorance, this sort of lack of awareness of of our dysfunctionality, keeps us bound in samsara. So while we remain ignorant of what's going on, we remain completely bound and stuck in samsara continually. And Jeremsha says, you know, the point about this is that um, um, when we're able to recognize pleasant feelings or pleasant experiences as suffering because of this contaminated mind that we're adding into it, then our attachment ceases. So when we begin to recognize that actually what is apparently a source of happiness is actually just a source of suffering, then we're able to release our attachment of it, right? Um, and he says, for instance, in terms of pain, in terms of pain, when we recognize that the pain arises um, because our mind has a tendency towards a negative attribution to pain rather than it just being a physical stimulus, then we begin to, when we recognize this as merely a physical stimulus to an experience, rather than us necessarily having to feel hostility and or towards the object or towards the person or towards the apparent cause, then we lose our hostility because what we recognize is that actually this is just pain. This is a natural arising of pain caused from the state of our body. So So when we begin to, and then he talks about neutral feelings, and he says, for instance, when we recognize particularly that objects are impermanent, exhaustible, and perishable by nature, that they are unable to sustain the qualities that we would imbue with them because they are impermanent and because they are insubstantial in terms of not that they don't have a material substance, but that they're not empowered even though we apparently empower them, they do not hold the power to cause us either suffering or joy. Then we our ignorance ceases, right? So our ignorance, the specific ignorance we're talking about, is the ignorance that imbues objects around us or our experiences, the objects of our experience, both internal and external, with this quality which allows us to empower them and therefore disempower ourselves in terms of saying they hold the key to my happiness, they hold the key to my misery. When we can let go of that, then we begin to be free. And Jeremy Bichet says this is an explanation taken from two Indian texts, the Compendium of Determinations and the Levels of Yogic Deeds, just to be clear that he's not just making this up. So then Jeremy Bichet says, you know, when if we want to look at it this way, this is going back to sort of weeks 1 or 2. I talked about this is Sisyphus, the famous Greek myth of Sisyphus, who having insulted the Greek god somehow or another was cursed forever to push a big boulder up a mountain. And within a Buddhist context, of course, we are cursed to push around this boulder of samsara while we are not liberated. So it was my sort of idea about using this well-known metaphor to describe our condition. And likewise, so Je Rinpoche says here, you know, if we're bearing a heavy burden, we're not really going to be happy. We're not going to be content until we can stop pushing it. So this, in a sense, is like even our path, our spiritual path. At first, it feels like we're just continually having to push a rock up the hill, and we will continue to suffer so long as we have to carry this burden. And he says, but this burden primarily is actually our deluded mind, and our appropriated aggregates, in other words, our conditioned reality. And though we might have occasional moments where he says where the painful feeling is absent, because we have these, we're repeating ourselves, because we have these dysfunctional tendencies of suffering and the afflictions, even these moments of joy, these moments of absence of pain, doesn't prevent us from this all-pervasive suffering, because our dysfunctional mind experiences them and creates yet new new attachments, yeah, or new aversions, new objects, new karma. So while our mind is broken, we continue to engage in broken karma, if you like that. So he says, primarily, this is, and again, this is repeating what I was saying earlier on. Since it's the suffering, it's the all-pervasive suffering of conditionality pervades all suffering and is the root of all the other types of suffering. It's this that we need to work on, and this which we need to become aware of, to the point where we become disenchanted with it. And as we become disenchanted with it, we become disenchanted with conditioned reality, or samsara, or our normal worldly life. In this sort of sense, the normal world experiences lose their allure. He then says, not only this, but what we consider to be pleasant feelings, or pleasant experiences, which, as we've said before, causes attachment to grow, they mostly arise from just a relief of suffering. The pleasure that we experience is actually not independent of the removal of suffering. In fact, it's like he says, for instance, if where we go on a very, very long walk, and then at the end of the walk, we find, you know, our feet begin to feel a lot of pain, our hips, or possibly our knees begin to go, our back begins to ache, depending on who we are and how good we are at walking. But the point about this is essentially after a point we begin to find the walking is increasingly effortful and more painful. And then when we at last get a chance to sit down and relax, there's a pleasant state of mind arises. But as the intensity of the suffering from the walking disappears, the pleasure that arises from the sitting gradually diminishes as well. So we can see, he's saying this is the point where we can see that there's actually a correlation between the pleasure of sitting and the alleviation of the suffering of the walking. And therefore what we can see is, in fact, this is not a pleasure at all. It's really just the alleviation of the suffering that we were previously experiencing. He's saying this is for some types of suffering, some types of happiness or joy, not always, but this is certainly something to think about. And he says, not only that, if we remain sitting in the same position, on the same chair, in the same way, then that becomes a bit too comfortable and suffering arises again. It's like, actually, I don't want to sit here anymore. Maybe I want to walk, or maybe I want to go and lie down. And so then following this, a very, very traditional Buddhist idea that basically from the very early sutras, the four foundations of mindfulness are recognizing walking, sitting, standing, or lying down, that regardless of whichever of these we happen to be doing, there comes a point where this is becoming really quite painful. So we need to migrate and do something else. So what we can see is there's no basic pleasure to one or the other. It's just that there comes a point when there's just too much. And we talked about this in terms of suffering and change. And likewise, this is also true in terms of eating or drinking. We can feel really hungry and we can eat and we can eat. And there comes a point where actually we really cannot eat, and eating anymore would lead to extreme suffering. Drinking is the same. For instance, standing in or sitting in the sun, it gets too hot to the point where we move to the shade, sit in the shade, then begin to shiver and get too cold, so we want to go back into the sun. So these sorts of things here, we can see that actually whatever we do for too long, after a point, it becomes suffering. Yeah. And because of that, what we can see is that actually a large amount of what we consider to be comfortable is really only alleviation of, or temporary alleviation of, another suffering. And he quotes Descent into the Womb Sutra here. Nanda, the physical activities of walking, sitting, standing, or lying down must each be understood as suffering. If meditators analyze the nature of these activities, they will see that if they spend the day walking and do not rest, sit down, or lie down, they would experience walking exclusively as suffering and will experience intense, sharp, unbearable, and unpleasant feelings. But and the notion that walking is pleasant will not arise. Nevertheless, and he then says the same for the three other activities. Nevertheless, Nanda, because they break the continuity of suffering in one or the other of the physical activities, some other new suffering arises, and this we take to be pleasure. So therefore, this contaminated feeling of pleasure arises when it arises. It is only suffering that is arising. When it ends, it is only the nature of this suffering that ends. And when it arises again, it is only compositional activity that arises, in terms of the fact of saying that it is only really, in a sense, the fact that there's a temporary alleviation from it, that we imagine that there's any pleasure involved. And then he cites Aryadeva's 400 verses again, of course, and Aryadeva says, pleasure, when it increases, eventually changes to pain. Pain, when it increases, does not change into pleasure, which is a very interesting and worthwhile point, that if we recognize one of the aspects of samsara is that whatever we do, when we continue to do it for too long, it begins to become painful for us. However, the pain, whenever it increases, doesn't somehow transfer into pleasure. And this is this. He mentions this without any discussion, but I think it's a particularly powerful and useful, profound point. So this is a short discussion on all-pervasive suffering, and it's one which is probably worthwhile considering in greater detail, because, as I said earlier on, this really is the gateway into spiritual practice. It's recognized by everybody as being this. It's probably the one thing that most people find actually hardest to accept in terms of the spiritual path of Buddhism. For instance, pleasure is worldly pleasure, normal pleasure is actually suffering by its nature, and yet it is this is the gateway to our spiritual path, and also to our ability to become bodhisattvas. So it's definitely worthwhile considering it quite carefully, and understanding it in terms of the context in which it's given, and not to be too quick to reject it because one doesn't necessarily find it easy to accept initially. But I think in many ways, although people think of rebirth and karma as being some of the main, or even Buddhahood as being some of the main obstacles to Buddhism, in fact, I think really probably recognizing all pervasive suffering as a truth is possibly the most important and hardest to accept at first, certainly. And yet it's that when we can accept it, then we can become really sincere in our practice. Without that, then it's a bit difficult to be sincere in our practice because we don't really recognize, we're not informed by our experiences or informed by the world in a way which allows for us to tie the truth of suffering and therefore the truth of the nature of samsara. And then we're looking outside of our experiences, we're looking outside of our minds for answers, if you like, rather than recognizing the mind is the basis for, of our journey to enlightenment. Anyway, so Je Rinpoche then goes on to talk about specific sufferings. And what this is really about is to do with saying that within the context of suffering, so the truth of suffering, up until the beginning of the middle scope, which started off with the truth of suffering, we were talking about the three lower realms. We're talking about the value of being reborn as a human. And so what Je Rinpoche wants to do in this case is to be clear that the other realms, the higher realms, or if you like, of the human, the Deva realms and so on, which are normally considered to be comfortable environments in compared to being reborn as an animal or a ghost and somewhat, then he said that the suffering continues within these two. This is what this is about. He says, first of all, human beings, most of us are aware of the fact that as human beings, we suffer. And he then goes into some of the ways in which humans suffer, including pain of hunger and thirst, heat and cold, having to look for sustenance, for food, becoming tired, birth, old age, sickness and death, sickness and death, and so forth. Most of these we are very, very well established and we're aware of. Then he says, Vasubandhu has said, this is very, very long ago, he said in India, he said, it's quite clear that humans have all of the sufferings of the miserable realms, tormented by pain like cow beings, deprived, they're like the ghosts, and also the same suffering of the animals, such as the fact that the powerful use force to disempower, to oppress and hurt the weak or those underneath them. And he said, this is normal. This is like a river, that in terms of the fact that it's just a flow, a continual flow of sufferings. He says, some suffering from poverty, from want, from disease. Others suffer from discontent. They're never contented with whatever they have. Some are incredibly jealous, envious, and so on. And all of these quarreling and often end up with killing and harm. So, and then Aryadeva, again from the 400 verses, says, and this is something His Holiness Dalai Lama has said his experience, and he mentions it quite often, especially when he's teaching to Westerners. He says, for the privileged, pain, suffering is primarily mental, and for others, the less privileged, it's physical. And he says there's never a day goes by when both these types of pain do not afflict the world. So in terms of this, the Aryadeva says the common people, but in generally, His Holiness says, that especially the poor nations, poor populations, where they're finding the basic needs for food, for healthcare, for roofing, for clothing. All of these are a continual daily struggle. And it's very easy for us, especially where we are, have the privilege of a national health system and a welfare state, for us to forget that this huge cushion that we have underneath us, which does a huge amount to assist most of us from these particular sufferings. And we sort of have a tendency to take them for granted. Yet, obviously, what that doesn't mean is that we cease to suffer, but our suffering is much more emotional, mental, and still persistent. So then in terms of then there are the demigods of the Asuras and the Devas and so on. So there's a little bit about the Asuras and Devas in terms of culturally, the Indian and therefore the Tibetans also, and most of this area have this traditional idea of these two types of being, the Asura and the Deva. If I'm not wrong, I think this idea originated from somewhere close to Iran or around this area, and it sort of is a very early idea that came into India, and you have, for instance, the Zoroastrians who think it's the Zoroastrians who recognize that it's the Asuras who are considered to be divine, and then the Hindus and the Buddhists who talk about the Dev as being divine. So, anyway, regardless, there are, I think the main point about this is to say there are many different types of being. Whether or not we want to accept or reject Devas or Asuras, I think is really up to us. But what we can see is that I think it's quite clear to say that there are types of being who might exist or are born, which are not necessarily material or animal in the same sort of sense that we are. And they also, regardless, have the same issues. They're still prone to suffering regardless. And the normal one traditionally given to the Devas is that they are aware of the fact that they are about to die, and they can see where they will be reborn, and it fills them with a suffering which is far more intense than we can recognize. And likewise, the demigods, the Asuras in this case, um, are very envious of the Devas, and they spend their entire time battling and losing, and they're never ever, even though they're incredibly powerful and able, they're not really able to recognize they're intelligent, they're not able to let go of this intense envy. So within this, all of the deities, and both the Asura and the deity, the Deva in this case, belong to what's known, and all of the other realms that we normally talk about, the animal realm and human realm and so on, belong to what's known as the desire realm. And the desire realm is that which, because it's to do with that, where we are, our level of concentration is below a particular level. So when we begin to meditate, then we can actually we come to a point in our meditation levels, in our terms of concentration levels, where we go from the desire realm concentration to which is where we currently are, into what's known as a form realm concentration, and then above that is the formless realm concentration, which is called the peak of samsara. And when one develops a form realm concentration, there is a degree of this is not necessarily Buddhist. This is any tradition where one has these very refined concentrations. One is born into the form realm, form God realm, but at that moment, within that state, there's no coarse suffering, but it's non-permanent. So again, at the point of death, then all of this collapses. And it doesn't matter how much the form gods or the form level deities wish to survive, the basis, the karma of their experience runs out, and it goes. So again, one of the other aspects of this is to say that there's I think there's actually within the desire realm is even these very high deities, if you like, these are aware of the fact that other deities have got more than they do, and so there's still this sort of lack of, you know, if we look at this in terms of, let's say, Hollywood stars or whatever, or the ultra rich, the billionaires, there are always those who are richer than me, right? And therefore, it's like even though I've got more than I could possibly ever spend in my entire life, and in fact that of my children, my grandchildren, and I have more wealth than nearly every single other planet, everyone on the planet. There are still three people who have got more wealth than me, and therefore I need to get a bit more, right? So this sort of mind remains regardless of what particular being we are. And then again, the point about the form and the formless realms is primarily that in the end, in the formless realm is when the mind, the formless realm deities dies, is just like there's no, there's the bounds, the conditioned reality, the conditioned mind is still tied to the same afflictions. There's been no cure, there's no release from samsara, and so there's only one place where they can go, which is back into the cycle of rebirth. And that takes us to the end of the further meditation of suffering. So that this is the last part of the chapter on the truth of suffering. And so then we're moving on to the second of the Four Noble Truths, which is the cause of suffering, the origin of suffering. And again, we are working towards the same point, which is to say, okay, what we are doing at this point is we are recognizing or working to recognize the truth of the fact that while we remain in samsara, we are hounded continually by suffering and the cause of suffering. So how does this suffering arise? What is the cause of suffering? And what can we do? Why do we need to know this? We need to know this because if we do not know the cause of our suffering, then we won't know how to cut the cause of suffering. Yeah. So on this, there are basically the suffering is in terms of the origin of cyclic existence or samsara, which is this continual cycle of suffering and across rebirth, are how afflictions arise, or afflictions will be defined, but we're talking about these mental dysfunctionalities, and how therefore we accumulate karma, and then how we die and we are reborn. So this is very Buddhist, a very very traditional Buddhist chapter, but essentially what we so let's go through it. So we start off with saying, how do the afflictions arise, right? In fact, it's later on. Let's start off actually a little bit later on. So Je Rinpoche says it's a sangha from the method tradition, the method lineage, compendium of knowledge. Gives a rough definition of an affliction, which is the affliction is defined as that which, when it arises, is disturbing in its character, and when arising, disturbs our mind stream. So we're talking about mental state, which is disturbing in nature and leads to disturbing our minds, our mind stream, and is also the cause of negative karma. Not necessarily directly, but it's the agent for it. So while karma and afflictions are both necessary for karma, for cyclic existence, for samsara to arise, Je Rinpoche says here that it's the afflictions which are primary. And he says the reason for this is that if just as a seed without moisture will not produce or soil, in other words, without the conditions for it, a seed will not sprout. So even if we have the seeds from previous moments of karma in our past, we need to have the conditions for those seeds to arise. So the karma in this case is the seed, and it is these correlating conditions which allow for of our afflicted mind, which allows for this karmic seed to ripen, to appear, to sprout. Yeah. He says there's no sprout of suffering because the karma lacks the necessary cooperating conditions, is the specific words that they've translated here. So the cooperating conditions are required in order for that seed to sprout. So another way of looking at this, he says, is that if we can say that afflictions are primary, because even, let's say, for some hypothetical way, that even without any previously accumulated karma, if our afflictions are present, we immediately accumulate new karma. Now, karma in this particular case is talking about negative or samsaric karma, karma that leads to samsara. So it is essentially the karma, our actions our samsaric actions depend upon, arise upon afflictions, and the results of that karma depends upon the afflictions in order to arise. And again, he says, Dharmakirti, a very well-known early scholar, says, if we are able to transcend, in other words, to achieve enlightenment, our craving for existence, we no longer wish to crave for our self-existence. We no longer have a craving of self. Then the karma that would normally ripen into us being reborn in samsara, it cannot ripen, because the underlying condition, the cooperating condition of that craving is gone, right? And he says, and this is because if we do have that craving, craving for life, then the aggregates will again arise. So I think there's an important point to say is that this might appear to suggest that when we achieve enlightenment, we cease to be, we cease to have a consciousness, but that's not the case. The continuity of consciousness within traditional Buddhism, the continuity of consciousness continues regardless. There are some different opinions on this in Buddhism, but within the Tibetan tradition, within the Lam Rim tradition, the continuity of consciousness is immutable, is unbreakable, although it might pause. Yeah, so there might be a time where the consciousness ceases for a short time, but the cause, its presence means it will continue again in the future. So therefore, even though we might no longer be reborn in samsara because of the lack of craving for existence, that does not mean that we are not, that our consciousness ceases. Our samsara consciousness ceases. That's what changes, right? So he says, because of this, it's because if we recognize that the primary cause of our of cyclic existences are afflictions, then it's quite clear that we need to rely upon a remedy for cutting or to remove our afflictions. And he says, in order to do this, again, we must understand what afflictions are. And it's good for us to recognize not only what they are, but to develop some knowledge about them so we can recognize them and see how they arise. So this is, we're now looking at primarily moving away from just being good and doing good into recognizing how it is that our minds begin to form these patterns of behavior which are in themselves toxic. So it was within the scope earlier of looking at preventing us from low rebirth. We were primarily sort of trying to work with developing some sort of opponent to cause anger, cause hostility, and again, cause sort of attachment or grasping onto other people's things and so on. And here what we're looking at primarily is actually recognizing, we're going a bit deeper into recognizing our minds and our mental nature in terms of what it is that we're trying to eliminate. So as I said earlier, this is primarily to do with what is disturbing to us, what is disturbing our mind stream, and is disturbing by character. Now, although again, Buddhism is really keen on lists because lists are very easy for us to work through. These are general general categories, not to be taken as an exclusive list. They describe the sorts of types of mind that give rise to, that have this sort of afflictive nature. Yeah. Some of them are very, very important and are very, very detailed. Some of them are more descriptive and sort of cover various areas of different types of mental state. So the first here, we have 10. So the first of this really is attachment, the one that's mentioned. And attachment in this sense is, again, this is a Buddhist attachment is noticing a pleasant or an attractive external or internal object and desiring it, wanting it. When it clings to that object and grows stronger, it becomes harder and harder for us to tear ourselves away from it. And this is one of the ways in which we can recognize it. It's like, oh, I really like that. Yeah. So that sort of, or him or her or them or whatever it happens to be, not necessarily it. And we might think, oh, I've got such a lovely nose. I really love my nose, you know, and get more and more attached to my nose and this sort of thing. So it doesn't really matter on, it might be, you know, oh, I really like, you know, this particular brand of ice cream. It's the very best. Oh, I really, you know, oh, you know, summer season, English strawberries. There's nothing quite like. So all of these sorts of things, we develop this stronger attachment, stronger objectification of it, right? Now, as I said before, actually, if you look at it in a sense, we are becoming disempowered by it. We're giving it, we're imbuing it with some quality that it doesn't have, in a way which is we are allowing our enjoyment to be wrapped up with and dependent on this this sort of idealization, yeah. But he then says it's about, he says it's hard to tear away from it, yeah, to let ourselves go, to not consider it when it's available to us or when we think about it or whatever. And um, and the example he gives is like trying to remove oil which has been soaked into a cloth. Now, of course, we have detergent nowadays, and we have, you know, Ariel or whatever, you know, not wanting to advertise or whatever it happens to be. And so that nowadays, like removing oil from cloth is quite easy. But back when Lama Tsongkhapa was around, there was no sort of easy washing powder for this sort of thing. So it was quite hard to remove oil from a cloth. And I think we can um, uh, except that that this shows some sort of difference between the 14th century and the 21st century here. That but we can imagine other things which might be hard to remove from you know, soaked in cloth, like maybe, I don't know, dried paint or something. But the point is essentially it's hard for us to let up to disentangle ourselves from the object of our attachment. So this is affliction. Hostility again, and why is attachment disturbing? Because because our mind keeps on going to it, and we find ourselves bound in terms of almost our identity with the object of our attachment. It is disturbing to us. It's not, it doesn't keep us, we're not able to keep a calm or a detached mind. Our mind becomes drawn to it like this. And I talk about things, but it's often animate, you know, beings of some sort too. Hostility is observing suffering, origins of suffering in terms of, not in terms of the immediate causes of suffering, the immediate causes of suffering, not the far cause, immediate cause of suffering, such as somebody thumping us, weapons, thorns, whatever, and and other living beings, for instance, and a harsh, tormented mind that contemplates harming these objects. So, for instance, this is like a sense of punishment, wishing to punish, wishing to squish, you know, like, so, you know, like mosquitoes, for instance, will squish it, right? That is a hostile mind. Right? So, likewise, feeling this hostility both towards those beings that are causing us pain, but all those for whom we protect. So we might feel protective towards or responsible towards a member of our community, and we might see suffering being caused to, somebody might be beating them or harming them or criticizing them, and this huge rage, right, being builds up inside of us, and we want to go give them what for. Yeah, yeah, not enough of that. And it, within reason, if we can do that with compassion, if we can actually act with compassion rather than hostility, sometimes this is appropriate behavior. Yeah, but if there's any mark of hostility in it, and let us not fool ourselves here, if there's any part of it which is the wish to cause suffering, uh, uh, the wish to punish, then this is hostility, and it's disturbing to the mind. We keep it. We any of us who've experienced this knows this boils through for quite some time, and often we feel like uncomfortable even once we may have achieved our goal of causing trouble. Pride. Again, we might notice something that we have internally or externally, qualities that are high or low. We might think, good or bad. We might, well, I'm the wickedest person on the planet. It doesn't necessarily be a high quality. We might feel great for being, a great example of our social status or our social group or cultural identity or whatever it is. I'm proud to be British. And this gives us, if you like, some sort of inflated mind, some sort of a sense of superiority. Yeah, in the end. So I have a sense of being superior, possibly in an antithetical sense, in terms of saying, I'm superior because I'm a champion of the underdogs. But it doesn't make any difference. In the end, it is still pride, and this itself is uh, um, essentially, because it's based on the idea of saying I am this, right? It's an identity statement, identity politics, and within Buddhist context, um, these sorts of identity statements are afflictive. They actually damage our mind. Ignorance is possessing a misunderstanding, specifically about the nature of the Four Noble Truths, not being able to recognize the Four Noble Truths, not feeling clear about them. And again, karma and its effects, and likewise the three jewels, enlightenment, if you like. So within this is clearly within a Buddhist context, but the point about it is that without this, without the clarity of the Four Noble Truths, without recognizing the Four Noble Truths and the truth of the Four Noble Truths, without being able to be informed by this, then one is going to remain in samsara. So one's not going to have the ability to see a way out, right? Again, so it's like the same as if we can't recognize the truth of impermanence or the truth of the suffering nature of our world, then it's going to be very hard for us to want to do anything about it. And a doubt, there's various different types of doubt here. So one of them is actually being inquisitive, in the sense of like saying, okay, what I want to do is to look more closely, to examine, and this sort of mind is actually not an affliction at all. This is sort of discriminating awareness is very powerful, very useful. On the other hand, a doubt which remains a doubt, where one does not wish to examine it, but one remains sort of unclear, is basically a derivative of the same form of ignorance, especially again looking at the Four Noble Truths and so on, karma and its effects. Is like saying, well, if I am not clear about it, then then I need to do something about that. So a doubt is again leading to oneself, in a sense, is a willful ignorance. Yeah. So before I talked about this and say, it's really very important for us not to have um, to dismiss these ideas. It's also very important not to reject. Okay, so if we're trying to be Buddhists and we're learning to be Buddhists, we might find karma, we might find the Four Noble Truths, we might find even Buddhahood to be hard to accept. So, but first of all, is not to reject it, right? And then within that is like to remain open, to remain open-minded that this is a possibility. But the point about this is we have to be careful not to go down into a position of doubt. So it's like a doubt leads to rejection. So even then, what we need to do is to retain an openness of mind. So then there's what's called the reifying. This is a translation. There was a discussion about how to translate this, but in the end, they went for a rather long phrase, which is the reifying view of the perishing aggregates. And particularly, this is important in certain ways. Is one of them is it's recognizing the three conditions of the person in the phrase itself. But one of them is that the aggregates, we are composite, we are not singular, we are composite, we are made of different bits and pieces, we are an aggregate, right? Secondly, we are perishing, we are continually changing from moment to moment. The person does not persist from one moment to the next. The continuum persists, but in that continuum, there is nothing remaining that is remaining from the previous moment. This is perishing. The rarefying view is the idea that somehow this continually changing lump of aggregates is somehow remaining and sustaining from moment to moment. And what we read here is the afflictive intelligence or the afflictive mind that looks at the aggregates that make up the person and says, "This is me, and these are mine. This is my nose. This is my glasses, and so on. This me, mine." And that is, he said, where there is a self that remains persistent across moment to moment, and that has the ability to own things. Yeah. And he says, to be clear, perishing means impermanent, aggregates is plural, and the term indicates that um, what is actually apprehended is simply impermanent and multiple phenomena. There is no permanent and unitary person. So it's the idea of the perception of the permanent unitary person that we feel arises at times, especially when we feel offended, for instance, or when somebody says, somebody takes something off our desk, and we might say, "That's mine." And at that moment, that idea of even if we've got some sort of understanding of the fact that we're a continual flow of change, at these moments, this strong afflictive perception of I and my arises. Another time is, for instance, at moments of fear. So there are some things, let's say, like I might be fearful of snakes, and when we see a snake or we see a hose that we think might be a snake, this very strong I arises, right? This moment of I. So there are times when this particular view is very, very easy to see, and it doesn't feel like, oh, I is some sort of language or some sort of attribution of some sort of impermanent changing aggregate of bits. It feels very, very unitary and very, very persistent. And that's the thing that is actually called the view of perishing aggregates. So that was the sixth. The seventh is an extremist view. This is again one again is where this is where we believe in a soul or Atman, where we actually believe that there is a permanent and eternal self, or, or alternatively that that there is no self, and therefore there is no rebirth. So there is like we die, we die in the and there is no rebirth is considered to be an extremist view within Buddhism, because without that there is no personal karma. So within this sense of even within, if we are within the scope we're currently in, where we don't have a universal um, a sense of universal responsibility, then it's quite important for us to have, especially when working on Four Noble Truths, we must, if we have this view where there is no rebirth, it's absolutely necessary for us to read these texts, the Four Noble Truths, with a sense of universal responsibility, because whereas we don't recognize a personal karma, personal effects of our actions, it is important for us to recognize the universal effect of our actions. And without recognizing the universal effect of our actions, we then believe that our actions have no consequence. If we believe our actions have no consequence, we're definitely walking into a false view, right? Because at that point, it's like, it doesn't matter what I do. If it doesn't matter what I do, then Buddhism isn't a path for us. Okay, it doesn't matter even if we find it difficult to accept rebirth or not accept rebirth is less important. If we can't recognize consequences of our actions, then it's very hard to see how one could sustain a Buddhist path. But in this particular case, what we're talking about is essentially the idea of within a viewpoint of the personal liberation, and within personal liberation, therefore, the scope given requires us to accept rebirth. Because of the fact that without rebirth, a personal rebirth, then there's no karma. If we accept a universal karma, then the way in which we would look at these afflictions are just very, very slightly different, in terms of the fact that the extremist view in this particular case would be the idea that there are no consequences, to our actions, right? And that's absolutely fine. That's correct. So then another one is a belief in the supremacy of these wrong views. So where we have these extreme views, such as recognizing an existent soul, for instance, then if we believe these views to be correct, or supreme or final, then this obviously is going to be an affliction. This doesn't mean that um, uh, um, essentially, this is very much to do with the fact that within the Buddhist context and where we're going to go with this, it's going to be very hard to accept these things if one is using this particular path. Um, so then there's another one which is specifically to do with belief in ethics and religious self-discipline is enough. So this is probably one of the more complicated of the afflictions in terms of the idea. As I said, these are indicative; they're not exclusive. But the point he wants to make here is that Jeremy is saying here is that if we believe that ethics is enough, but keeping our behavior good is enough to free us from samsara, we're making a mistake, because essentially, although we will be creating a large amount of good karma, positive and causing a lot of happiness, what we're not doing is breaking our bond to samsara. We're not actually freeing. We're still disempowered, and this is because we're not addressing the root cause of suffering. We're only basically addressing the actions that lead to suffering. And then he talks in general about wrong view, I'm not so yeah, wrong view and the supremacy of wrong view are seen separately here. wrong view is this this idea that there's no karma and its effects, for instance, or that there is the ability of a divinity of some sort to free us from the effects of karma, or that there is a no Buddhahood, no enlightenment. There is, for instance, a far more relevant in our modern world is, for instance, a wrong view which suggests that we are suffering, recognizing the suffering and the nature of suffering of the universe, but there is no escape. Yeah, and this is a very important wrong view because a lot of people whose lives have led them to recognize the privation of suffering naturally then believe there is no escape. And because they also have a wrong view or mistaken or potentially mistaken view that there is no rebirth, they commit suicide. And this is why actually in many ways it's really important to know the context within which the Four Noble Truths are taught has to be within somebody somebody who is not who is either able to recognize future rebirth or is able to recognize the importance of the universal responsibility of accepting that it doesn't matter whether or not my life is going to be filled with suffering. I still have a purpose, and that purpose is greater than my own personal suffering. And without that, then this can be very dangerous. Okay, so that's basically we've gone through the pervasive suffering or conditional suffering, and we've also looked at the afflictions, the 10 classic afflictions, and how afflictions are, if you like, the cause of suffering in themselves. And then what we're going to do next is to talk about how they arise, the order in which they arise. So what's important about this is essentially this list of afflictions, which are a very traditional list, gives an idea about how they all create a disturbing mind or prevent us from being able to progress along the path. And yet what we need to do is to identify which of these are the core affections that bind us to samsara. Because some of them are preventative, but some of them are actually the ones which cause the most problem. And one of them specifically is what we'll go into next week, is the one which binds us most to samsara. I'm sure you can probably work out which one it is. It's not wrong view. And I think that's where we'll leave it today. So we're in the origin of suffering. We're now in the second of the Four Noble Truths. The origin of suffering is probably what we'll be doing next week. And then we'll be looking at two more chapters. And then we will be moving on to Mahayana, the Bodhisattva path. Okay, so dedication. Any benefit at all from this, I hope will go towards us trying to find a path for ourselves creatively to establish a sense of direction, spiritual direction, in terms of working towards recognizing pervasion of suffering and using that to become more determined to leave samsara, to recognize in that recognition to develop a sense of great compassion towards all sentient beings who are similarly stuck, and use that to become determined to achieve Buddhahood. Okay, let's just take a minute to meditate either on the breath or on trying to begin to recognize the pervasion of suffering.